My name is Mark Lewis. I am 48 years old and I work as a bodyguard at various high-profile events. My wife Ann, who is 43 years old, and I have been married for 20 years. We have a son who is now in school and dating a girl in another city. Ann and I had a quiet life until a series of events occurred that forced me to make a difficult choice. This is my story. One evening as I was working an event for influential business people, I was standing in the corner of the room. My job is to provide security and remain inconspicuous, but my thoughts were far away from here. In the quiet of my home, which is on the outskirts of the city, my family was waiting for me. At least my wife was, since my son hasn't lived with us for a year now. Suddenly, the phone in my pocket started vibrating. It was strange since Ann knew I was at work. With anxiety in my heart, I went out into the hallway to answer it. Ann was on the other end of the line. Her voice sounded strained. She informed me that our car had broken down in the middle of the road and she was stuck. This increased my anxiety because it was getting late and Ann had to get home from work. I began to speak calmly and confidently, trying to reassure her. I explained that I was at work and couldn't be there right now, but gave her the number of a support person who could come and help quickly. Ann understood and replied that she understood. I could hear the relief in her voice. After making sure she was okay, I hung up the phone. I went back to my duties, but a part of me stayed with Ann. Every 5 minutes I checked the phone, hoping to hear good news from her. However, there was never a call. As the event wrapped up, I prepared to leave. Exactly 1 hour later, my phone vibrated again. It was Annie. Her voice sounded calm. She informed me that she was already home. I asked if the tow truck had arrived. Ann answered in the negative. Instead, she was approached by a strange man who helped her start the car. She paid him $100. I sensed a note of uncertainty in her voice that made me wary. Brushing the doubt aside, I said I was glad she was safe. We said our goodbyes, but the worry never left me. Who was this man? Why didn't Ann take the help I offered? These questions swirled around in my head. I tried to suppress them. All I wanted was to get home to my family as soon as possible. The road seemed longer than usual. With each kilometer, my desire to see Ann and make sure she was okay only grew stronger. As I drove toward our house, I felt my heart start to beat faster. Despite the late hour, our house seemed like a cozy island in the darkness. The lights in the windows told me that Ann was waiting for me. There were no cars in front of the house except the one in the garage. I breathed a sigh of relief. She really was home and safe. When I opened the door, I expected to see Ann in the living room, but no one was there. Ann, my voice broke the silence of the house, but there was no response. I headed to the kitchen and found a note, taking a shower, tea in the pot. Her handwriting always reassured me, even now, when doubts were brewing in my mind. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, mulling over the events of the evening. My thoughts swirled around the man who had helped Ann. Who was he? Why hadn't Ann waited for the tow truck as I had advised? An unpleasant feeling sprouted in the back of my mind. I tried to suppress my anxiety. Perhaps Ann was simply afraid to be alone on the road. This thought was confirmed in my mind when Ann came down to the living room. Her hair was still damp, and she had put on her favorite evening robe. Her smile was warm, as always, though I noticed the tiredness in her eyes. "How was your day?" she asked, hugging me. "I was more worried about you," I replied, responding to the hug. "Tell me what happened." Ann sat down across from me. Her story was brief. She described how her car suddenly broke down and how a stranger offered to help. She mentioned that she paid him, but was silent about what he asked in return. Her voice was calm, but I sensed there were gaps in her story. "You don't know who he is?" I asked, trying to hide my curiosity. "No," Annie replied with an evasive smile. "Just a good Samaritan, I guess." I wanted to believe her. On the other hand, nothing bad had happened. I was just a little upset that someone else had helped my favorite wife instead of me. I decided not to press her or ask her any more questions about that evening. Instead, we just talked about everyday things until tiredness made us both get up and go to bed. But before we went to bed, we decided to give in to the passion that had been so scarce lately. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My sleep was restless, and I greeted the dawn lying on the edge of our shared bed. Annie was still sleeping peacefully and quietly beside me. I hugged her and kissed her cheek, getting out of bed. I tried not to wake Anne and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Thoughts of yesterday's accident were still bothering me, and I planned to check the car today. But before that, I need a distraction, I told myself as I cracked eggs in a frying pan. When Anne joined me in the kitchen, her face was lit up by the morning sun. She smiled at me, and for a moment I forgot all my doubts. We ate breakfast together, discussing plans for the day. Anne had the day off. She was working at the bank. I thought it was the perfect opportunity to take her out to dinner at a restaurant. How about we go out to dinner tonight? I asked. However, Anne quickly replied, I'm sorry, I can't. I've made an appointment with Frances and I'm going shopping with her. I accepted this with understanding, but was still disappointed that Anne had chosen to spend the evening with her friend rather than me. Frances was her work colleague. They got along very well. Frances came over several times. Annie left the house around 5 p.m. I stayed home and went to the garage to check what happened to the car yesterday. Turns out it wasn't anything serious. The tube leading to the gas tank had fallen off, causing the car not to start. The man tightened it yesterday and the car started. I tightened all the parts. I spent about 4 hours in the garage, fiddling with the car and taking components apart. The process calmed me down. Downstairs, waiting for Anne, I suddenly saw her pull up in front of the house. She parked outside the garage and quickly ran inside without saying anything to me. This puzzled me. I went back inside and found the bathroom occupied. About 20 minutes passed and Anne came out, wrapped in a towel. Anne, I began as she walked over to me. Is everything okay? Why did you run away so suddenly? She paused for a moment, then looked at me puzzled. Everything's fine, she replied. I really needed the bathroom, and I was feeling dirty, so I was a little abrupt. Mark, is something wrong? No, I replied hastily, realizing that my hesitation might hurt her. Just worried about you. By the way, how was your night out with your friend? It was great, she replied. We sat down to dinner and everything seemed to be fine. Although I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that an invisible wall had come up between us. It was like it was hard for us to stay as close as we were before. I checked the car. I said to Anne, it was a minor thing, so you can safely drive it to work tomorrow. It'll be fine. Oh, that's great, she replied. I remarked, that guy obviously had the nerve to charge you $100 for a minute's work. Anne thought for a moment when I mentioned the $100. After a few seconds, she replied, $100. Yes, I'm not good at this stuff, so he took advantage of the situation. We both laughed and went to bed. I wanted intimacy, but Anne said she had to get up early for work tomorrow. For the next few days, we just went to bed. I felt an internal struggle. On the one hand, I didn't want to give in to paranoia and suspect Anne without reason. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from me. Anne seemed to be distancing herself. She started coming home from work later and spending more time on her phone, as if my presence no longer interested her. When we had another day off together, I suggested we go out to a restaurant, reminding her that my earlier idea still stood. But Anne brushed it off. I'm going out with my friend Frances again. I was upset, but said nothing. Silently, I gathered myself and left the house. Anne didn't seem to care where I was going. Not knowing where I was going, I decided to go to the bank to deposit some money. I walked into the bank and saw a familiar face. It was Frances. Oh, Mark, how nice to see you. Frances exclaimed with a smile. Hi, Frances. I replied, trying to sound casual. Yeah, I just stopped by for a minute to take care of some business. Anne usually gives us a heads up when you're going to be here. This would have been much quicker, she continued. Yeah, but this time I decided to stop by spontaneously. I was close by, I said. By the way, Anne mentioned that you went shopping together recently. Did you buy anything? I asked, trying to look as innocent as possible. Frances' face changed. She seemed a little embarrassed by my question. Well, actually, it's been a long time since we've been shopping together. I've hardly seen Anne outside of work for the past few weeks. I offered to have coffee last week, but she declined, she began, visibly hesitant. Her words were a cold shower for me. Anne had lied to me about them going shopping together. The thought flashed through my mind. My heart pounded frantically, and I felt anxiety growing in my chest. Well, I have to go. Thank you, Frances, I said, trying to hide my confusion. Yes, Anne has really been busy recently. We said our goodbyes and I walked out of the bank feeling even more lost than before. Questions swirled around in my head, raising more and more doubts about Anne and our relationship. On the drive home, I tried to gather my thoughts. One thing was clear: I needed to talk to Anne, but how to bring it up? How do I ask her about something that could so easily destroy the trust between us? I returned home with a heavy heart. The encounter with Frances and her words replayed in my mind, stirring up a storm of doubt and suspicion. Anne greeted me with a smile, but this time I sensed something lurking behind her smile. The dinner was tense, though Anne didn't seem to notice. I decided not to bring it up right away. I needed time to think it over and decide how best to proceed. I went to bed that night, but soon decided to act. I needed to find proof of Anne's lies or to confirm her innocence. The idea of checking her personal belongings came to mind. I realized it was an invasion of privacy, but it seemed I had no other choice. After making sure Anne was asleep, I started with her bag, which she usually left in the hallway. Inside, I found only her purse, makeup, and a notebook for work. Then I went to her desk in the living room. There were papers and work notes in the drawers, but nothing suspicious. Finally, I decided to check her cell phone. I knew her password, the date of our wedding. My hands shook as I entered the numbers. The phone unlocked and I started going through her messages and calls. There were many messages from coworkers, friends, family. Nothing that would raise suspicion. This both relieved and upset me at the same time. I decided to discuss the situation after all. Why had she lied to me about going shopping with her friend? I spent the next day in a state of anxious anticipation. Work was not going well. My thoughts were focused only on my upcoming conversation with Anne. When evening came and I heard her enter the house, my heart beat even faster. I realized that one of the most difficult conversations of my life was about to begin. Anne entered the living room with a smile, but noticing my seriousness, she stopped. "Mark, what's wrong? You look so worried," she asked, stepping closer to me. I sighed, trying to muster all my willpower. "We need to talk. There are things I can't keep to myself anymore," I began, trying to stay calm. She sat down across from me. Her gaze became wary, but still reflected love and concern. "I was at the bank yesterday and ran into a friend of yours who told me that you two haven't gone out together in a while," I managed to say, watching her reaction. Her face changed instantly. Anne's look became frightened and she turned pale. "Mark, I can explain everything," she started, but I held up my hand, stopping her. "I need the truth. All this time you've been lying to me about meeting Frances and where you were going." The questions poured in one after another, each one increasing the pain in my chest. Tears came to Anne's eyes. She took my hands in hers and began to speak, her voice shaking. "Mark, I have some problems right now that I will definitely tell you about, but I need time. Please don't think I'm cheating on you. You seem to be implying that." Her words stunned me. I felt relieved, but something still bothered me. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why do you say you have a problem? We're a family, and we're supposed to solve problems together, right?" I asked, feeling a lump in my throat. "I tried, Mark, but every time you came home you were so tired. I didn't want to burden you with my problems," she replied, her eyes full of tears. We talked until late into the night. I tried to find out what problems Anne was facing, but she said she needed time and then she would tell me everything. She tried to reassure me, saying that it was personal and that it wouldn't ruin our marriage. That conversation was a moment of truth for both of us. We realized that our marriage was in crisis, and if we wanted to save it, we both needed to work on it. I promised Anne to spend more time at home and to be more attentive to her feelings and needs. She, in turn, promised not to hide her worries from me anymore and to share everything with me when the time was right. When we went to bed, there were still many unresolved issues between us, but this was the first step in rebuilding trust. I fell asleep with the feeling that despite everything, we could overcome this together. In the days after our conversation, I felt a certain balance beginning to form in our relationship. We both made an effort to socialize more and spend time together. It seemed like the spark that had been missing lately had reappeared between us. But in the back of my mind, I still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Anne sometimes stayed late at work or left for a couple hours on her day off. I tried to trust her and waited for her to share everything with me. My job required my constant attention, and I tried to focus on it so my doubts wouldn't take over. One day, I was assigned to guard an important event in the city. It was to attract many famous personalities, including businessmen. I prepared for the event as a regular job while Anne was to stay at home. I spent the entire evening being vigilant for order. Suddenly, my gaze fell on a couple entering the hall. My heart sank. Next to Stephen Mason, the organizer of the evening was Anne. She looked stunning in her evening gown, but that fact only increased the pain in my chest. All my suspicions and fears suddenly took shape, becoming a painful reality. I stood as if chained to the spot, watching them laugh and talk to the other guests. The world was crumbling before my eyes with every smile Anne gave Stephen. How could she? Why? Questions swirled around in my head, but I couldn't find any answers. I don't know how much time I spent watching them. The most frustrating part was that there was nothing I could do. I couldn't intervene as I was on duty and had to keep order. I tried to hide so Anne wouldn't see me, and my observations were successful. I saw Anne and Stephen kissing, and it hit me right in the heart. I managed to take a few pictures on my phone that no one saw after that night. I felt completely shattered after seeing Anne in Stephen's company. They seemed so happy and relaxed that it was a real blow to me. Now I was faced with the dilemma of what to do. I spent several sleepless nights pondering it until I finally came to a decision. If Anne had decided to play by her own rules, it was time for me to change tactics too. I started with a plan. I needed to proceed carefully so as not to break the law, but at the same time my actions had to be convincing enough for Stephen to realize that interfering with someone else's family was a bad idea. I didn't want to cause physical harm. My goal was to make him feel the same pain and humiliation I had experienced. At the same time, I didn't want Anne to find out that I knew anything. The first step was to gather information, so I hired a private investigator. I began to follow Stephen, studying his daily interests, his habits. I discovered that he regularly frequented the same restaurant on Fridays, played golf on Sundays, and often attended various social events. He also frequents the same hotel 2 or 3 times a day. I planned to use this information to organize a series of random mishaps that would make his life less comfortable. I started with minor mishaps. I signed his phone number up for various advertising and spam emails and left anonymous negative reviews of his work online, but I thought that was too little too late. I wanted him to really feel the pressure. The next step was to organize a small incident at one of the events organized by Stephen. I used my skills and connections to completely cut the power to the building. After about 20 minutes, all the guests, including Stephen, dispersed. He went to the parking lot, and before he could get into his brand new Mercedes, he was grabbed by 2 thugs named Dog and Sir, who quickly grabbed Stephen and threw him into the trunk of his own car. Stephen screamed and threatened the whole way, claiming he had serious connections. It was useless, however, as he had already been taken to the woods 200 miles away from the city. His threats proved powerless. No one touched or beat him. He was powerless. His car was left on the road and Stephen himself was deep in the woods, late at night, alone, with no means of communication. I thought this would serve him well. If he was lucky, he would end up in jail, not in the cold woods, because more than 5 kilograms of illegal substances were found in his car left on the side of the road. I had to pay a considerable amount of money, but it was worth it. However, I did not know what to do with Anne while working with the detective. I received many pictures of Anne spending time with Stephen. I also didn't want to arouse suspicion. Like Stephen, the car was found the next day and the guy eventually made it out of the woods. He got in his car and drove off in an unknown direction, but was later stopped by the police. News reports revealed that the famous businessman was involved in distributing illegal substances on a large scale while under the influence of alcohol, found to have more than 5 substances in his system. This led to Stephen being detained before the investigation began. He had good lawyers who argued that the whole thing was a setup and he was framed, but there were no known facts or evidence yet. During this time, Anne had changed considerably. She stopped missing work and even agreed to go to a restaurant with me where we had a great time. I realized that Anne had been cheating on me and lying to me for a long time, but since Stephen had been indefinitely detained, things between us had improved. I didn't want to file for divorce because I loved Anne. However, I also wanted to know the truth. "You look a lot better than you did a few weeks ago," I started the conversation. "Yes, Mark, I have something to confess to you," she said, took a deep breath and continued. "Did you hear that Stephen Mason got arrested? That rich guy," she added. "Yeah, what about him? Did he hurt you?" I asked. Remember when my car broke down? She began, clearly struggling to talk about it. Steve drove up and helped me. But in return, he demanded that to do it right here in the seat of his car. I paused briefly, giving her time to pick up the words. I refused, but he started threatening me. Said if I didn't do it, he'd ruin my life, she continued. After that, he kept my phone number. That same night, he sent me an address where I was to come the next day. I told you I was going with a friend, but I went to the hotel with him, Anne admitted. This went on for weeks. Steve said he would leave me alone, and I hoped it would come, but he was always calling or texting me, inviting me to his events like I was his girlfriend. He repeatedly raised his hand to me. I was forced to act dignified and pretend everything was fine between us. I felt enslaved and didn't know what to do. I was afraid to tell you because I thought you would leave me. I was really scared, Anne finished, tears streaming down her face. I put my arms around her and kissed her. It's okay now, honey, I said. A few days later, the news broke and Steve was charged with trafficking in illegal substances. The story was that he had been driving under the influence of alcohol the night the event was canceled. He was facing a lengthy prison sentence. While at first I thought my actions were very harsh, I now think of them without a shred of regret. Anne still doesn't know that I know everything. I haven't filed for divorce because I feel she loves me as much as I love her. Whoever was guilty has already been punished. I cringe at the thought of how I could have let it all go. And I wonder why Anna never told me about it when it was all happening. After all, if anyone could have helped her, it would have been me. Anna and I started seeing a psychologist and going to sessions together after this whole incident left a deep imprint on her. I believe we will get through this and she won't feel guilty for what happened. I understand why Anne didn't want to tell me anything and I don't blame her. I was furious that my wife was being used and blackmailed and I wasn't paying attention. That's the end of this story. Write your opinion in the comments. What do you think of this story? Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like. Good luck!